Hello and welcome to episode 101 of MMO Weekly, first one of 2025, presented as always by Chitty's Cheesesteaks. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, joined by a couple of MMO veterans here, Mathias, Altman-Kurosaki, Christian DeBlock. Guys, thanks a lot for coming on again. Really appreciate it. There might be a couple things to talk about since the last time I might have saw you guys. I'm not really sure. But I think we could start with a certain somebody, Jesse Winker, getting re-signed by the Mets, came out today. 1 year, $8 million with the $1 million signing bonus brings it up to $9 million. I think as far as the depth piece, fourth outfielder, left-handed pop for the lineup, I think it's a great thing, lengthens things out. Obviously, we know we didn't have a great regular season for the Mets last year when they traded for him, but all folks remembers the postseason. Obviously, had some big hits for the Mets, and I think was a good clubhouse glue guy for them. Seemed to mesh really well. So just want to get you guys kind of reactions first here on the signing of Winker coming back. Mathias, let's start with you.
Yeah, I like this deal. I think, first of all, he's a good fit for the clubhouse. I noticed that he had a ton of energy, which is really great for the squad. And he was great in the postseason. An 1167 OPS. That's really, really strong. I believe at one point it was the highest it might still be the highest in Mets history for a single postseason or all time in the postseason. So he really showed up in October. Hit a big home run against Aaron Nola. He hit a couple of triples. I believe he's the franchise leader in postseason triples. But he's more of a platoon bat. But it's a 1 year deal. I mean, he'll get as much as $9 million. So there's little to no risk in this deal, and I really, really, really like it. It feels like he's a guy who's kind of born to be a Met, and we get to watch him for another year.
Yeah, I echo all of that. To go along with the idea that a platoon of Jesse Winker and Starling Marte, if Starling Marte doesn't get traded, I think that's great for the DH. Now, I mean, we'll see how things play out with Marte, but Winker, didn't have a great regular season, as you mentioned. But again, when you have those moments in the postseason, to go along with the way you are in the clubhouse, having those relationships prior to being on the Mets with guys like Lindor, I think that just bodes well for the camaraderie with the Mets, which was obviously fantastic last season. I expect nothing less in 2025. But yeah, not a lot of risk with the 1 year deal. I think he will hopefully be healthy. I know he had that back issue at the back end of last season. So yeah, I think there's not a lot of risk here. He checks a lot of the good boxes for a left-handed bat. We'll see how much he plays in the outfield, but certainly as a left-handed DH, I like this one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point you made as far as platooning with Marte. If he's still here, it remains to be seen. We'll see. But it's definitely an upgrade as far as a fourth outfielder, like you're saying. Pop from the left side of the plate as a DH. I know that there were reports they were in talks with a guy like Alex Verdugo. I think this is a much better player than that. I think they got a much better version of an Alex Verdugo. Like you said, hopefully he can stay healthy. But obviously proven he mixes well here in the clubhouse with the Mets, playing in New York. Mathias, like you mentioned, he's kind of a guy that felt like he was destined to be a Met one day, and it's great that it happened in a meaningful game. So I think it's obviously something that should work out well for them. Interesting to see how the rest of the roster shapes out, even like you mentioned, Christian, with Marte, if he's even still here by spring training or something like that. But definitely good depth piece to round out the roster. Unfortunately, though, that means that they're out on the running for Pete Alonso. $9 million now, all of a sudden, the richest owner in sports. He can't afford Pete Alonso now, according to reports. I don't know how that makes a whole lot of sense. But obviously, it's a good segue to Pete. I know those reports came out by Martino as far as that this is now the Mets plan B. I really don't buy that. I think there's posturing on whichever side you want to call it. I don't know. But it still feels like inevitably, whether it's going to be a long-term or not, probably not, that Alonso will be playing for the Mets at least in 2025. Christian, I'll start with you. Just kind of your thoughts on, the Mets plan B now to not go after Alonso with big Jesse Winker coming into town.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think it's simply a play to the media to kind of shift things a little bit. Why he would not sign with the Mets is beyond me. I not to mention that where are the suitors for him, and the suitors that are going to pay him what he wants.
Right.
The Blue Jays, I guess, make some sense, but you're going to make him a full-time DH with Vlad there unless they trade him. the Angels, maybe the Mariners, if they can facilitate a trade for one of those big starting pitchers. I just don't see it. I think it's just simply a media play. Boris is, trying to do whatever he can to get his client a little more money. I think it probably winds up as a 3-year deal. And maybe there's an opt-out one maybe in there if they want to please Pete a little bit. But I just don't see a way where he goes anywhere else. I think he wants to be a Met. I think the Mets want him to be a Met. And Stearns is being a good guy in this situation and taking all the emotion out of it. So I still think we see Pete as a Met in 2025 on a 3-year deal. What the money is, we'll see. But I do not see him going anywhere else.
The tough thing is that he did reject a contract. That's the other thing, is that he reportedly got between 68 and 70 million was the offer for 3 years. And the tough part about this is that at first I was thinking, all right, maybe that's a bit of an underpay. But when you think about it, he only had 2 Fangraphs WAR this year, which is equated to only 16 million in value, which, I mean, you think about it that way, then 23 million annually, that's kind of generous. And now I don't know if anyone else will give him what he wants because, you mentioned the Mariners. The Mariners feel like the team that should have signed him 6 weeks ago or something.
Right.
But the Mariners don't tend to spend much. They only signed Donovan Solano recently. The Blue Jays, to me, doesn't make much sense because the Blue Jays just finished in last place and should probably be rebuilding. And supposedly they're talking about maybe moving Vlad Guerrero back to third base, where he was not a good third baseman when he played there. So I think I'm not going to say that the Mets are completely out on Alonso. I think there's a chance that, maybe nobody else gives him what he wants. He circles back to the Mets, sees if the original deal is still on the table, and he takes that. But I mean, I don't know where else he could sign. Maybe he is a Met next year, but I'm not expecting an immediate decision. He might be waiting until the middle of February at the earliest.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, especially with Boris being his agent and everything like that. I think a client, it seems like we saw obviously last year kind of what happened with a couple of his big guys, that if they're not getting the deal, they'll wait until right until spring training or into spring training, whatever. You hope that doesn't happen for his sake or whatever. But as far as the Mets are concerned, they're playing the market correct. You guys hit the nail on the head as far as they offered him a more than fair contract extension last year. That he chose to bet on himself. And listen, if he had an Aaron Judge kind of walk here and hit 60 home runs and was crazy and on top of the great postseason that he had, people would call him a genius, right? But obviously he didn't have as good of a regular season as folks would want. The sport doesn't really value his position like it once did as far as giving out these free agent contracts. And I think as far as the most money, the most comfortable, it's still all seems to, go back to the Mets. They know the situation as far as, I think probably with a lot of teams, they're willing to pay for Alonso, a decent AAV for short years. They don't want to pay for the back end of a contract for a 30-plus-year-old first baseman. He's a premier slugger in the sport. We know that. But he seems to be getting a bit one-dimensional offensively. And he doesn't play defense and run like the Matt Olsons of the world, the Freddie Freemans, hit for that kind of average, get on that kind of base at, at a 400 clip. So, he is a bit limited in that sense. And I think he's seeing that in the market now. And the Mets are doing exactly what they're supposed to. They're not playing emotion into it, right? Stearns certainly isn't doing that. I think they value him obviously to a certain number and to a certain degree, and we're seeing that. And I think we'll see what ends up happening, obviously. But it still seems like it's just going to play into the Mets' favor better as far as, a cheaper option for them, bringing him back here.
And really, I think the divide here is that the Mets are trying to pay him for what he's been in 2023 and 2024. And he's looking to get paid for what he was from 2019 to 2022, where he was a much more complete hitter. I think, both sides are playing hardball, and that's kind of what has led to this impasse. But like I said earlier, I'm having a hard time thinking of another team that will pay him or another team that makes sense for him to go to.
Yeah, because the money is, again, as you mentioned before, it's 23-ish around the year. I mean, I think that's totally fair for what he's provided and projecting what he's going to be for the next, let's say, 3 years. So I don't know how any of these other teams are going to muster up the money to pay him what he wants. So I think the longer this goes, actually, I think the longer it goes, the more likely he's a Met. That's how I see it. Because I mean, at some point he's going to have to just jump at the number that is on the table currently, if it's still there. Let's say in 3 to 4 weeks, maybe even longer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. I do think it's going to go probably into deep into February, first couple of weeks, whatever it is. But like you said, Christian, I do think the longer this takes, it just helps the Mets better and better because again, comfortability is a thing, right? It's a place he understands. The team likes him as a person. I think that very much is evident. I think they would like to keep him around as far as with the clubhouse and stuff. They're just not going to overpay. They did that already to obviously to a degree with Juan Soto. Not that it's a bad thing or anything like that, but they chose what bucket they wanted to go into, and I think Alonso is still to them considered a luxury. So it seems like they're standing pat where they're at. They could do the 3-year deal with a couple opt-outs, whatever. Even if you're paying them $30 million a year, whatever. I still think it works out good for both sides. But we'll see how these next few weeks play out. Because I think there are a lot of teams that could use a slugger like Alonso. I just think they're willing to say, "Hey, we'll pay you for 1 or 2 years, not the multi-year contract that you're looking for." And that's where he's going to struggle. So, be interesting to see how the next month or so plays out for him. We did bring up the Blue Jays. Interesting enough. Part of this Plan B circle back. There's a certain first baseman that you mentioned played third base, but he's first baseman right now. Vladimir Guerrero Jr., pretty good. Free agent after this year. But apparently the Mets have called, kicking the tires. Again, don't know if this is more posturing on the Mets' part to light a fire on Alonso. This is, however you want to read into it. But it's never a bad thing to call on a guy who's like a perennial MVP finalist. So that sounds like a good thing. Just want to get your thoughts on, potentially a Vlad Guerrero Jr. trade and what you guys think it might look like. Mathias, go ahead.
I'm all aboard on this personally. Guerrero, in my opinion, is the best first baseman in baseball currently. He's also still 25. He's going to turn 26 right before the season begins. So I think the package they give up will hinge on whether or not they get an extension done first.
Sure.
Because the Blue Jays are negotiating an extension, apparently. So the Blue Jays are doing everything they can to keep Guerrero past 2025. But I think they probably would have to give up, some combination of Jet Williams, Orion Clifford, and Brandon Sproat, maybe, or Nolan McLean, or maybe, Drew Gilbert. So one of probably 2 of those players, I would say, and then throw in either Brett Beatty or Tyler McGill, maybe an Acuna type. So I would say my final package would probably be Williams, assuming there isn't an extension involved. Probably be Jet Williams, Brett Beatty. I'd put Acuna in there and then McGill. It's a 4-for-1, I understand, but you're getting a great player, even if it's only for a year.
Yeah, I think my one hesitation on him if you look at his numbers in his 2 okay seasons and compare it to what Alonso did in the last 2, they're pretty comparable. I do love Vladdy, though. He's excellent at the plate. Obviously, he's had some monster seasons. But there is a little hesitation, especially when you are going to consider paying him long-term, and he's looking for, I would assume, at least $500 million over a huge amount of years. So I guess if you're asking the options of paying Pete for 3 versus, I mean, it's not a guarantee you can even get Vladdy to an extension, but if you're saying, I don't know, 15 years for 500 plus, I would go Pete. But there obviously is a lot of interest and why we would want to get Vladdy because, again, he's, as you guys have mentioned, one of the best first basemen, maybe the best first baseman. But I think there is definitely, at least on my end, some hesitation paying him long-term. But your package for a 1-year potential for Vladdy is, I attest to that. I think that's a pretty fair deal, 4-for-1, given the players that we have in the system.
Yeah, true. I mean, that's a great point. I can't imagine the Mets giving 2 15-year contracts out back to back. They're 30 years for 2 players and it would feel like $8 billion. I don't know if even Steve Cohen wants to do that. But, I mean, as far as the players go, you can't go wrong with either of them, whether it's Alonso or Guerrero. I mean, I'm not going to complain with either guy if they're playing first base and hitting behind Soto come, opening day. I wouldn't be upset at either. But, I think as far as what you're saying, that long-term commitment, it might be tough because they just did that with Soto. Alonso in the short term is probably the better play there. But it's interesting to see. It's fun. It's just fun to see the Mets in all of this, and being aggressive and being in on all these names. It's fun to see. And I guess another alternative we haven't even talked about. The Mets are also maybe considering moving Vientos to first base from third, and then maybe you sign a third baseman. I don't love Alex Bregman. He's not a guy I would pay over Alonso. But it is obviously another route. The Mets are, there's some flexibility there. And again, I don't know how much this is all ultimately posturing to, entice Alonso to sign here sooner rather than later. But, it seems like the Mets do have some options here at the first base position. That's not Pete Alonso.
And the other name I saw today was Anthony Santander.
Okay. I don't love that either.
The tough part with Santander is that he's largely a DH. He has played some first base in the past. I don't know. It's 13 games in his career. I wouldn't necessarily consider that like a big enough sample size to put him at first base, but he's a bat to consider, I think. He hit 44 homers this year.
Sure.
He's been a big power bat for a few years now. So they're considering that, and maybe you move Marte, maybe you get another corner bat, but I think I think Santander or Bregman, you consider it. I wouldn't necessarily say swing for the fences though and try to sign one or both of them.
Yeah, Santander, he's fine. I think it's a fine signing if you can figure out a way to put it together. And I also think he would maybe be willing to take a short-term deal. I think I've seen some of those things, so it's definitely an option.
Yeah, he scares me a little bit, especially when, like you see, they have about 18 outfielders already. It feels like he hasn't had a lot of time at first base, and eventually your first baseman is your right fielder. So they'll have to figure that out in a few years. That's why I still think all roads lead back to Alonso. It just kind of makes too much sense for both sides. But we'll see. It's interesting. Fun things to talk about. There's obviously still a lot of shaping up with the roster, especially on the pitching end, which I want to get to also. A guy that's getting thrown out there now is Tanner Scott. Obviously, Mets known from a time with the Marlins. Last year had a great year with the Padres. Mets could use a power left-handed reliever like that, especially from the left side. More arms, the better to get to Diaz. Just kind of want to get your thoughts there on a guy that probably could potentially really help the bullpen there.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Scott, we've seen him for years. We kind of have a good idea of what he is, and especially what he's developed into. Because I know the first couple of years, there was some times where the erraticness was there. But, I mean, last season, a sub-2 ERA. He was great with Miami. Then he was great with San Diego. I think mixing him with Diaz, having two power arms from each side, gives you the flexibility to say, if Edwin Diaz needs a day, we can have Tanner Scott close.
Sure.
He can work as a setup guy. So I think it makes a lot of sense. He's only 30, so I think there's still a lot of, juice on the arm, and he's got plenty to go. And I think this is a guy I'd be willing to give multiple years to. I know some people have flirted with, maybe 3 years. I think that's fine. I guess the question is, will Stearns be willing to pay the fee for that to go along with what Diaz has already been paid? So I think that's the only question mark. Scott's a great fit. I think his stuff plays, and I think having the combination of Scott and Diaz would be a match made in heaven.
Yeah, and really my one hang-up, like you said, is going to be the price. I saw, there were rumors about him maybe making $20 million annually. Personally, I would caution at having two $20 million relievers in your bullpen, but he was, I think, the best left-handed reliever last year. Mm-hmm. He was worth, on Baseball Reference, he was worth 4 WAR. I know that using WAR for relievers is tough, but he was really, really good. He was good in the postseason too. And most of last season, the Mets only had one lefty in the bullpen. And by the end of the season, that one lefty was Danny Young. And Danny Young is, he's a fine left-handed reliever, but, when Bryce Harper and Kyle Schwarber are coming up, or Matt Olson or Michael Harris, when those guys are coming up, would I want Danny Young in there, or would I want Tanner Scott in there? Tanner Scott is a fireballing lefty who can probably strike both those guys out. I'm not saying Danny Young can't do that, but I think getting Scott would be a game changer. Like I said, there are big left-handed bats in the division, or if you get further along, you have him face Otani probably and Freeman. This would be a match made in heaven, I think. They need a left-handed arm, and it sounds like they're willing to go out and get a top-tier reliever. So I think Scott should be priority number one if they're looking at relievers.
Yeah, agreed. You know, I do understand that the whole not having those two big money relievers in the bullpen together, but Cohen's obviously showed that he doesn't care about if he can get the best players. So I kind of am in the camp of with the way the starting staff is, there's still stuff that can be done to that too. I'd like to secure that back end as much as I can. So if you can bring a Tanner Scott 3 or even 4 years, like you said, at 30, there's still a lot of juice in the arm left. He seemed to really figure it out, especially last year. I know it's tough year to year. Relievers are volatile. You don't want to pay off a big year. But I think as far as with the need for the Mets, I would be willing to take that risk and think he would be pretty good there in the eighth inning, bridging Diaz. So, if they could do it, that would be awesome. I have a feeling they're going to be bolstering this bullpen one way or another, whether it's moving to Marte or signing a guy like Tanner Scott. I don't think they're done yet as far as rounding this roster out because, frankly, they still need to. National League is stacked. And if they, even with Soto, if they want to compete, they're going to have to do a few things here around the roster out. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how the next few weeks play out, especially on the Pete front and everything else. But that's going to wrap up everything for this week. We'll catch you next week as far as everything that's going on in Mets land off season, where Alonso signs and everything with that. But as always, everybody, let's go Mets.